This is Ghost, one of my war horses. He's a Lusitano stallion, he's a breeding stallion, and he comes all the way from the far south of Spain. He's an old Baroque type, so he is not particularly tall compared to other horses, modern horses, but he's exactly the right height for a medieval destrier, which is part of the reason I got him, but also part of the reason because he's such an interesting character. Now, Ghosty had a problem with his stomach, had a problem with his intestines, which is a thing called colic, horse colic, and any horse owners will know that that can be potentially lethal. So he was very, very ill a few months ago, and thanks to the intervention of my vets and the Newmarket Equine Hospital, he had his operation and he's made a full recovery. He's healed up now, but he's effectively been on bed rest, stable rest for 3 months. So he's lost a lot of his peak musculature. So I've got to do a lot of training with him to get him back into the physical specimen, the physical conditions that he deserves to be in. At the same time, I was listening to one of the Metatron's videos, hi Raf, and he was talking about a lot of the data behind how dangerous medieval jousting was. And quite frankly, the evidence is pretty clear. If it goes wrong, it can kill you. Jousting is a lethal sport. It doesn't have to be lethal. It shouldn't often be lethal, but it's definitely lethal some of the time. So the Metatron was talking about how dangerous jousting is, and he also asked me specifically what my personal experiences are. So I've been jousting for a long time. I've been jousting for many, many years, and I've done many, many tournaments over those years. Most years when I was actively jousting, I was doing 7 or 8, 10 weekends during the summer. So I was crossing lances hundreds and hundreds of times every year. I'm going to get on Ghost. I'm going to do some of his training, his warm-up, just gently trying to build up his strength, and talk about some of my experiences with jousting and what we can do. I also carry a sword because I think that's sort of useful to get a horse used to having on me, and it's also useful for me just to have another weapon there. Right, come on then, let's get on you. Walk on. Good boy. Good lad. Good boy. Good lad. You'll probably notice I quite often use mounting blocks to get on horses. That's not because I can't get on off the ground. It's just because it's easier for me and it's easier for the horse's back. When you pull and put your weight on the horse from the ground, you necessarily put a lot of pressure on their spine, you twist their spine, and some of my horses are a bit older, so I like to do things the easy way if I possibly can. I can get on off the ground, but I just prefer to use a mounting block if it's there, and I'm pretty sure medieval knights would have preferred that too. Good boy, walk on. Good boy, come on then. Good lad. I'm just going to pick up a practice spear. This is slightly shorter than my jousting lances, but it's just useful. It's a good size. It's made of ash, so it's fairly hefty. And you'll notice that I hold it at one end, really. So the balance, just helps build up my muscles and things like that. Now, for jousting, my feeling about medieval jousting is that possibly, like today, lots of people didn't train and lots of people did train. So you had quite a wide variety of different skill levels. You had people with all the gear and no idea, as some people term it, and you had people who were from very humble beginnings and just wanted to have a go. Come on you, come on you. In the modern era, there are really two or three different types of jousting. There were really 2 different types of jousting until about 12 years ago, when Philippe Willaume and I were the first people in hundreds and hundreds of years to actually use real solid lances against each other, against helmets, and try and basically break real lances, medieval style, with metal tips against each other in competitive tournament in public. That paved the way for a lot of other people to realise it was possible to do. And now there's quite a few people, not that many, but you know, a good handful of people that do what we call solid lance jousting. And as a result of that, we're getting a lot more injuries, which is interesting. So the first type of modern jousting, you could call it theatrical or stunt jousting. These are the scripted events with horses that there's the white knight and the black knight, and there's usually flaming swords. It's very Renaissance fair. It's incredibly entertaining, but it's scripted and it's designed to entertain people, which it does incredibly well. The riders are almost always excellent horsemen. It's not really meant to be historically representative, though. It owes its allegiance as much to Hollywood's interpretation of history as real history. In some ways, though, the pageantry is appropriate. There's a lot of pageantry and performance and performing to the crowd, which I think was probably done in medieval times as well. But it's not competitive as such. And the lances are often, if you look at the videos, you will see the lances are often held like this. They're held under the elbow, which results in nice safe impacts. They're often made of fiberglass. They often don't break. They're hitting against shields very specifically, which is perfectly legit and perfectly historical. But they use this technique. They're often counterweighted at the back as well, so the lance is easier to hold horizontally. And they gallop along and they hit. This transfers the minimum amount of impact to somebody else's shield, and it means that the lance, you can just drop the lance very, very easily. In contrast to balsa jousting, which means the lances have a breakable 3-foot tip on the end, where you actually physically couch. You might couch it probably about here. It's physically couched and locked under your armpit and held here, and you often lean forward to try and get the maximum impact. That's exactly the same technique you use for genuine solid lances with a steel tip. Exactly the same. You just have to dedicate yourself to the impact, perhaps more than you do with balsa. Balsa is still incredibly dangerous, by the way, but doesn't hit as hard, or rather doesn't hit in quite the same way as solid lances. I'll come on to the types of lances in a little bit, but I also want to talk about my experiences of injuries, for example. So, in my career over more than a decade, I have struck 3 knights from the saddle, or caused them to fall. I've hit them and they've been unseated and they've fallen off as a result of that. So I'm quite proud of that. None of them were injured, other than to their pride perhaps a little bit. And none of them had any lasting injuries, maybe the odd bruise, that kind of thing, but everybody was fine. Horses were fine as well. I personally have broken a hand twice. I've got bad thumb injuries. For example, sometimes the lance gets caught up and then the lance crosses over and catches, and you catch your own hand and thumb against the lance, and that can cause injuries. So probably, I don't officially know that I've broken my thumb, but I've probably broken my thumb. I've certainly broken my hand a couple of times. I've been semi-knocked out. I read out. I didn't actually black out, but I saw red. My vision was filled with red, which is a very unusual experience. And it was actually in this building itself, in practice. Somebody hit me very hard. I think it was probably Andreas, one of my colleagues in jousting. Hello, Andreas. He hit me really hard with a breakable lance, but the tip of the lance broke, but then the end follows through and hits you really hard. And I think it probably skipped up and hit me in the head through my helmet and knocked me backwards. So you knocked backwards, and 1, 2, maybe 3 seconds of redness, and then I came round. I did go to the hospital afterwards to check for things like concussion, and they just said, just keep an eye on it and, you know, stay safe. And I was fine. Didn't have any adverse effects as a result of that. I have also been in jousts where people have got balsa tips embedded in their ocularum, in the eye slit of their helmets. So a good friend of mine, Graham Turner, who's an excellent artist, you should have a look at his artwork if you can. He does lots of historical paintings, does a lot of work for a series of books, Osprey books in particular, and he got a lance tip wedged in the eye slot of his helmet, and that was pretty scary. I don't know how close to his eye it got, but close enough that you don't want to do that again if you could possibly avoid it. In a lot of our sports jousts, the head is not a key target. You don't get points for the head. In fact, in some of it, if you strike somebody in the head, you automatically don't get any points. In some, you can agree to have the helmet as a target, and in original medieval jousting, we think that the helmet was the prime target. You've got the helmet, you've got the body, the arms, anything above the waist, and the targe, the target, the big shield that is used as well. Gets you different types of points and different systems. The principle of jousting is, of course, to break your lance on the opponent well. It is not actually to knock the opponent off in most jousts, although there are types of jousts, particularly from the Holy Roman Empire, that did seem to involve trying to knock the other person off the saddle. So I've seen near misses like that. I've also hit somebody in the helmet really, really hard. And I did, before the event, say to him I didn't think it was a suitable helmet. It was an older style helmet, kind of pot helm with a narrow eye slot, but it didn't have any reinforce, and it wasn't particularly thick and heavy metal. I was a bit nervous about it. He said he was fine, he's done lots of jousting, so I took his word for it. Anyway, unfortunately, I hit him just below the eye slot. It's usually the left eye, because they're coming from there, so it's usually this side of the face rather than this side. If you hit on the right side of the opponent, chances are your lance will ping off. But if you hit on the left side, it's more square on to the lance. Anyway, hit him, he rocked backwards, and I thought, oh my goodness, that's quite frightening. That was very high. It wasn't intentional, but the lance just did go high. And the tournament was stopped. And we all had a look at the helmet, and the helmet was stoved in towards his face by about an inch. So I bent the cheek part of his helmet in a long way. I didn't actually, on looking at the video afterwards, I didn't get that close to his eye, but it was on his cheek, and the impact of the lance, delivered properly, couched, was such that it bent the metal of that helmet in. Now, the helmet did its job. It saved him. Otherwise, I have no idea what would have happened if he wasn't wearing face protection. I wouldn't have jousted against him, but in a battle situation, that probably would have killed him. But in that case, the helmet did its job. The helmet was hammered out again, and I refused to ride against him again until he got a different helmet, which caused a little bit of concern amongst the organisers, because they had to reorganise all the runs. But I felt that helmet was not safe. Safety is a combination of training and the right equipment and luck. You can have all the right equipment and all the right training, and if you're very unlucky, something can go horribly wrong. You can also have the wrong equipment and the wrong training and bad luck, and that's more likely. There have been, in my experience, I'm aware of 2 people, unfortunately, who in the modern era who have passed away. A chap called Paul Allen, who died performing a stunt for Time Team. He was on the television. The footage is actually used in one of the time, not the footage of his accident, but the footage before the accident is actually used, 2 jousting nights. That obviously went through the courts and the coroner, everything, but effectively what happened is a piece of the balsa slid up his shield and went through his eye slot into his brain, and absolute tragic accident, and killed him. He wasn't very experienced, and neither was the other person as well, though. So you always have to, the question was asked by the coroner, was this acceptable and all that kind of stuff. And the coroner said, yes, it was just one of those tragic accidents. But you do often have to ask yourself, have I got the right equipment? Is it as safe as it can possibly be? Now, perhaps slightly unsettling for me was that I was asked first to do that event. I was asked to go on the Time Team and to do the joust for them. And I gave them a quote, and I told them, that I could do it and I'd be interested. but they didn't use me in the end, so I was out of it. It was only several months afterwards that I learned of this tragic accident. And there have also been people injured by failing body armour. As more people have started to joust with solid lances and prove their mettle, standards of armour generally have gone down a little bit, and as a result of that, more people are having more accidents. And I think that possibly happened in the historical period as well. My gut feeling is that there were people that were jousting who were not really prepared as well as they should be. We know that Henri II of France, in around 1570s, something like that, he died again with a lance through his eye into his brain, broke the blood-brain barrier, and he died 9 days later in what was said to be intense pain, and they couldn't do anything. They couldn't actually do anything for him today either. It's just not possible. So back in the medieval period, they tried valiantly. All of his surgeons and doctors tried to save his life. He was the king after all. They couldn't. Now the stories behind that are that he got really angry, and he was really frustrated and angry, and he decided to joust anyway in spite of being told he shouldn't joust, and it went horribly wrong for him and for his opponent who was ordered to joust against the king, and as a result got into a lot of difficulty politically and socially from killing the king, as you would imagine, even though it wasn't his fault. He was just doing what he'd been ordered to do. So one has to be very aware of the risks of jousting against an opponent. One of the big things I do, I better walk Ghosty on, I've not been training him very much, I've just been chatting. One of the things I've always done in a tournament is try to make sure that my opponent has good equipment. So that just means if I don't know them well, if they're not friends and colleagues, I feel I need to just go and meet them, check they're skilled enough, ask them what their level of experience is, and surreptitiously check their equipment, because if they look like they've got poor equipment, then I think as a competitor, as a jouster, you need to potentially make the decision of not running against them. In spite of the fact that you might forfeit the tournament, I feel that there is a point at which an opponent is sufficiently unprepared to mean that it is not knightly and not chivalric to actually tilt against them. I think you have a responsibility to your fellow competitors, so you have a responsibility to your opponents. Joust of war or joust of peace, I think that really should apply. I have also ridden down the list towards somebody and realised that their visor is unfastened, and I've pulled my lance, kept riding, pulled my lance, kept it vertical, which is a signal for a pass that you're not trying to hit somebody, and their visor's been refastened again. So you have a responsibility to your opponent as well, in my opinion. One thing happened to me that was very weird in my early era of jousting up at the Royal Armouries. Then Her Majesty's Royal Armouries, now His Majesty's Royal Armouries. I jousted and I thought I was hit. I hit them, they hit me quite high on my helmet, and I could suddenly get lots of light. I had lots of light on my face and wind on my face, which I thought was a bit weird. And I thought, oh, they must have struck my visor off, which is really weird, and it does happen. And I wondered what it was all about. And they'd hit me so hard that they deformed my helmet slightly sideways, and the visor had popped open, and the visor had slammed upwards very, very rapidly, and exposed my face after the impact. So you could argue I came very close to severe injury at that moment. Now, one of Raf's questions was about how you feel about the injuries. And I would say, whilst I have broken bones, whilst I have winded people, knocked them out, I've collapsed from heat exhaustion before, when it was incredibly hot and humid once at a joust, I don't feel I've had any severe injuries. So I feel I've had minor inconveniences. And that's about it, really, from my perspective, although you could argue a broken hand was a major injury. It doesn't really feel like it was a major injury, but I guess you could consider that to be a major injury. It depends. It wasn't life-threatening, it healed up, got a slight bump in my hand as a result of it, but it's fine. I felt it was fine. And as a competitor, I felt it was completely acceptable outcome of a joust that I very much enjoyed. So I hope some of those anecdotes have been useful for you. I haven't really done much training on ghosts, so I'm going to do some more training now after I've switched the cameras off. But I thought it would be interesting for you to hear some of my personal anecdotes. Biggest thing, takeaway about jousting is train well, practice, wear the right kit, and be focused on safety as much as winning. Winning is great, and we should all try and win, but walking away well from a joust is also very preferable.